Welcome to everyone to today's event. We're going to be talking about China's maritime coercion in the South China Sea. And I want to thank FPRI as well as the members and the supporters for making this kind of programming possible. I'm Michael Beckley. I'm the director of the Asia program, and I'm also a scholar at AEI and a professor at Tufts. We have a truly wonderful, excellent expert panel to explain what is going on in the South China Sea. And I'm so glad that we are talking about this topic because I think for every 100 pages that are written about a potential war over Taiwan, there might be only one page on the possibility of some kind of horrible clash in the South China Sea. And yet the risk of conflict in the South China Sea seems alarmingly high. If you've been reading newspapers, usually on maybe page 13, it tends to not be front page news, but you've probably heard about the recent skirmishes near Second Thomas Shoal, this obscure reef about 100 miles west of the Philippines. And it's really brought this long simmering issue into sharp focus because there the Philippines maintains a precarious military presence with this rusty shipwreck that it's using as a makeshift base for a handful of what have to be some of the unluckiest Marines in the history of armed force. And, an international ruling in 2016 said that this area lies within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, but China almost immediately rejected that ruling and has repeatedly attempted to block any type of resupply missions to that outpost by doing various things, blinding Filipino crew members with high-powered lasers, ramming supply ships, and blasting them with water cannons. And so, I think this story tends to end up on page 13 because a decrepit ship in some remote part of the Spratly Islands kind of seems like an absurd place for the world's two most powerful countries in the United States and China to be having a face-off. But the United States has extended security guarantees, not just to the Philippines itself, but to its forces, its aircraft, its public vessels that are operating in the South China Sea, which presumably includes this rusty hulk of a shell of the BRP, the Sierra Madre, the ship that we're talking about, which the Philippines deliberately ran aground on the Second Thomas Shoal in 1999, and which China is now off and on blockading. So this isn't just a local territorial dispute, but this is becoming a test of whether the United States will and can defend a strategically important but militarily weak ally over its territorial claims, and also to uphold an international treaty, the UN Law on the Sea, which the US itself hasn't ratified. So you can't make this stuff up. This is an explosive and extremely complicated situation. But as I've said, fortunately, we've got literally two of the world's leading experts on this topic to lay it all out for us. So I'm pleased to introduce Ketian Zhang, first of all, who is a professor at George Mason University. She specializes in Chinese economic and military coercion. Her research has been published in the leading academic journals and has received multiple awards. And her book just came out recently. It's called China's Gambit: The Calculus of Coercion. That's out with Cambridge University Press. I highly recommend it because it helps lay out the broader patterns of the things that we're talking about today. Ketian's coming to us from Beijing, so she gets extra praise for sacrificing her sleep to enlighten us all on this topic and give us the view from China. Zack Cooper, our other panelist, is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He focuses on U.S. defense strategy and alliances in Asia. He's previously served in senior positions on the staff of the National Security Council. He's worked at the Pentagon, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's a prolific writer and commentator. He's always in major media, and he's also somewhat of a shadow ambassador. I think every time I've traveled abroad, I always run into Zack running from some meeting to another. So he travels to Asia quite frequently, and he wrote a great piece for War on the Rocks about a week ago that was titled "The South China Sea, the Dog That Hasn't Barked Yet." So, Zack, I think I'll start with you because you just wrote this recent piece that I think really helpfully lays out recent events and kind of puts them in a broader context. So could you just, for those of us that aren't watching this situation on a daily basis, could you sort of provide an overview of China's recent activities, especially near Second Thomas Shoal, and whether you think that this is just sort of more of the same of what we've seen for years in the South China Sea, or whether you think certain aspects of this fundamentally signal something new about either China's strategy or its risk tolerance and may imply that there could be future escalation here?
Well, first, it's wonderful to be here with you, Mike, and obviously with Ketian as well. She's done such wonderful work. You can't see her book right over my shoulder, but it's there. Uh, it's really, I think, a critical moment. There we go. It's really a critical moment, is for all the reasons that you mentioned in the South China Sea, and just showing how remarkable it is. Many experts and I think government officials now worry that a crisis in the South China Sea is more likely in the near term than a crisis over Taiwan. And so you're exactly right. People talk a lot about Taiwan, but the near term concern increasingly is around Second Thomas Shoal. I do think this is different than prior incidents. I wrote a long 300-page report a decade ago about South China Sea issues. And what you see if you look at the last decade of activity is really that China has not often taken an action that is as escalatory as what it did on June 17th. This is when a Philippine armed forces member lost a finger. There was, I think, the real threat of escalation there. And my view, and interested if Katian shares this, is that the challenge here is that Beijing is showing a real willingness to escalate in ways that many people didn't expect. I think that's true of both people in Manila and in Washington. And so I think the risk now is that there will be another incident. After all, there are going to be more resupply missions that the Philippines is going to do to the Sierra Madre. And that if China continues to escalate, that this will eventually require the United States and the Philippines to invoke Article 4 of their mutual defense treaty. I don't think anyone wants that. I doubt China wants it. I don't think the United States and the Philippines want it. But that clearly seems to be the path we're on. And let me just say one other word, because in the last week, we've actually seen some direct discussions. An undersecretary in the Philippines met with his counterpart in China. And I think there's some effort to make progress between the two countries. But my view is that this is President Marcos's last effort to do this in a way that could be de-escalatory. He's trying to talk with China about ways out of this crisis. I just don't see a lot of room on the Chinese side and willingness to enter into serious talks that would lead to any sort of de-escalation. And so I fear we may be in a little bit of a lull at the moment, but one that could lead to even greater tensions over the next few weeks if these negotiations break down.
Ketian, are you seeing the same thing? You've spent years studying patterns of Chinese coercion, both economic and military. Do you share the same impression that Zach does, that this actually does mark an important escalation, and that while the two sides, the Philippines and the Chinese, seem to be talking right now, that we shouldn't put too much faith in that because this situation just seems loaded with potential escalation?
Um, I think so. First of all, thanks so much for having me here. I would say I do agree with Zach to a certain extent in the sense that this current episode seems to last much longer than compared to say the Scarborough incident back in 2012 or even like previous resupply missions on the part of the Philippines with regard to the Second Thomas Shoal. So it's not the first time that China has stopped or blockaded the Philippines from the resupply mission in around the Second Thomas Shoal. I think the events around 2013, 2014 would be, I guess, the more recent ones when it comes to the Second Thomas Shoal. So it definitely lasts longer because it started, I think, around sometime last year, right? So it lasted almost, I don't know, 9 months or so. And the longest incident when it comes to transportation in the South China Sea would be, I would say, in the past would be the Scarborough Shoal incident, which lasted about 2 months or so, and in which China used not military gray zone coercion as well as economic sanctions, but it lasted about 2 months, and the two sides, I would say, eventually sort of de-escalated. So when it comes to duration, I would say the current incident does last much longer. But at the same time, I would maybe add just a little bit of caution about continuity in some of Chinese foreign policy behavior when it comes to um, coercion in the South China Sea in the sense that it's not the first time that China has used coercive tactics of such, especially targeted at the Philippines. I would say the frequency as well as the magnitude of China's gray zone coercion, especially when it comes to the Philippines, would be much greater than compared to, for example, Vietnam and Malaysia, with whom China also has territorial disputes with. But at the same time, I do see that there is still at least a base level of continuity when it comes to when and to whom and how China uses coercion. But I do agree with Zack that the magnitude is definitely much longer and much greater than compared to before. But ultimately, I think at least we can still group China's use of coercion in the South China Sea against the Philippines in this case as gray zone, but it's getting much more gray than say white compared to the past. And I think maybe this leads to an issue of perceptual differences when we talk about escalation or de-escalation. So from China's perspective, using Coast Guard ships would be a way to prevent further escalation, but it's not perceived as such by either the Philippines or the United States. So it might not be the case that China wants to escalate to, say, military use of force or much further, but it's a perceptual difference as to what is escalatory and what is going to lead to further escalation. I think in this case it might be.
And Ketian, just to quickly follow up, because you studied Chinese coercion not just in the South China Sea, but for example, on the Sino-Indian border, the East China Sea. Do you see, you said this is still kind of within the realm of the categories that you've outlined. And so it's not necessarily a difference, completely qualitative difference, but it's sort of a difference of degree. It's getting grayer, as you said. Do you think that this also fits a part of a broader strategy of China trying to consolidate or reassert its territorial claims? Because we've obviously seen flare-ups on the Sino-Indian border. Or do you think that there's something specific going on here that makes this pattern of coercion, especially towards the Philippines, fundamentally different, either than compared to other neighbors in the South China Sea or with India or with Japan, say, in the East China Sea?
That's a very great question, and I think as a political scientist, I like to find patterns and assert that that these patterns maintain. So I think I would say one of the reasons why I think the current situation around the Second Thomas Shoal is getting more, I guess, intense, but still within the realm of China's use of gray zone coercion is precisely the contrast with India. So when it comes to China's territorial disputes with India, we almost always observe China using military coercion directly, basically the PLA. Like when it comes to clashes in those border areas and border regions, it's almost always the PLA that's at the front line. You actually don't see land-based gray zone forces in those border areas, even though they are readily available. So I think it does point to a distinction between how China approaches land-based border disputes with regard to India versus maritime disputes in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. I think part of the reason has precisely to do with what Zack just mentioned, which is about to what extent the United States would be willing to or is legally bounded to provide, for example, military assistance, right? So with the Philippines, the United States is a treaty ally, and China does recognize that. But when it comes to India, China's view is that India is far from being a formal ally with the United States, and there are a lot of differences. And China is more, I guess, comfortable or has less constraint when it comes to actually using direct military coercion, as opposed to, say, these like more gray or less military kinds of tools as compared to the South China Sea. So I would say if we're talking about patterns of China's use of coercion, territorial disputes with India would be one category where China's more likely to use military coercion, whereas maritime territorial disputes in the South and East China Seas would be more of like a different category. Although I would say with Japan, in the past 10 years or so, I think their management of the territorial disputes have been much more stable than compared to the South China Sea.
Okay, so I get why China is maybe more willing to escalate with India, just given that India is probably going to be on its own. But then that begs the question, why? And this is for you, Zach, first, and then I'll come to Ketian. Why is China seemingly singling out the Philippines for special punishment? Because my understanding is that Vietnam has actually been much more assertive about building out its military presence in the South China Sea, especially recently. And yet China seems to be giving Vietnam a bit more of a free pass, at least compared to earlier years, whereas the Philippines is just coming under enormous punishment. And you would think that given the alliance ties and the clarification that the United States made in 2019 that Filipino vessels are protected under the treaty, that China might be more deterred. And yet it seems almost like it's going after the Philippines as some kind of juicy target, perhaps because of those alliance ties. So what's your take about why China seems to really have it out for the Philippines right now?
This is a fascinating question, and I'm really interested in your view and Katian's because I don't think we know the answer yet, or at least I don't know the answer yet. I've been very surprised that given the scale of what Vietnam has done in terms of land reclamation the last few months, we're talking roughly almost half of what China did in 2013 and 2014 in terms of acreage. I mean, this is a lot of land reclamation in some cases. That there hasn't been more of a response from Beijing. And Greg Polling and I suggested a couple of possible explanations, but admitted that we don't know the answer. If I had to guess, I would say that Beijing feels that the Philippines has just gone too far, right? And that its involvement of the United States in the region is something that Beijing wants to push back on very, very hard. And so I think this is, as a result, a very important test, not just for the Philippines, but for the United States, of how committed Washington is to being in the region. And if China is going to pick on one of its treaty allies, how forcefully the US is going to stand behind that treaty ally. As you both mentioned, the case of the East China Sea, where Japan had some very tense standoffs with China, especially in 2010 and 2012. That actually calmed down a little bit from 2014 onward after the US made a very clear commitment under President Obama to the US-Japan Security Treaty. Now, as you noted, Mike, the US has made a clear commitment to the Philippines. It even clarified that commitment under the Trump administration, but that has not deterred increased Chinese pressure. And so I think we're now at this junction where you could make an argument that if the Philippines was accepting a bit more risk like Vietnam has, perhaps China would back down. But you could also make an argument that actually the Philippines and Vietnam are fundamentally different because China is dealing in Vietnam with a leadership team that is, the Communist Party of Vietnam, rather than a democratically elected government, which is fairly US aligned. And so I think there's this open question about if the Philippines pushes back harder on Beijing, what will the response be? Will it trigger China to walk away a little bit, or will China just ramp up the pressure? And we don't know, and no one wants to see that tested, but I think that's probably where we're headed over the next few months.
And Zach, do you think the military balance matters here as well? Because Vietnam can potentially pack a punch against China, but it just seems like the Philippines, they have two frigates, a handful of corvettes. I don't even know how many of those could fire a missile. And so it seems like if push were to come to shove, that China could wipe out the Filipino Navy, or at least its offensive forces, in a single skirmish, and that maybe that imbalance of military power sort of makes the Philippines a very enticing target, because you have the symbolic importance of the treaty relationship with the United States, as well as the fact that the Philippines is the country that took China to the world court and won. And so what better way than to basically stick it to that interpretation of international law and the US alliance system in Asia, while running relatively low military risk. Do you think that has anything to do with it, or is it more sort of the, as you pointed out, that's the regime type in Vietnam and maybe some of the things that are going on the ground?
I definitely think that's an important factor, and I would just highlight two aspects of it. First, it suggests that the United States and the Philippines need to work really quickly to bolster the Philippine military to make sure that they can do their job and deter conflict. I think the second question, and this is a question, is whether the United States, as a result, will have to become somewhat more directly involved. So, for example, I'm not advocating this at the moment, but I do think there should be ongoing discussions about whether, if China continues to press on the Philippines in this way and take risky actions, whether it would make sense for the US either to have ships and aircraft very nearby as resupply efforts are being done, or in the most extreme case, for the United States to conduct some of those resupply efforts directly. Now, those are big alliance questions. People in Manila and Washington will certainly want to debate them at length. But I think ultimately, if China continues to press, you're right that Beijing is probably not that worried about the escalation dynamics with Manila. But China in general has been very worried about escalation with the United States. And so there will have to be this question about whether US forces become somewhat more involved if we really want to deter an escalation from happening.
Okay, I want to come back to what, if anything, the United States can do. But before we do that, Ketian, I want to get your take on why the same question, why China seems to be singling out the Philippines. And I know you've written invoking the old Chinese aphorism, you kill a chicken to scare the monkeys. You make a bloody example out of a relatively weak enemy in order to send a message to some of the stronger enemies. Do you have is that your sense of what's sort of going on here, that this is a big symbolic attempt of China to really stamp its foot down on the territorial issues while running low military risk?
Yeah, sure thing. I think several things here. And first of all, yes, I agree with killing the chicken to scare the monkey. At least, thanks for bringing that up. Although every time people ask, I can't explain why the chickens and the monkeys are always like related. So I think first off, I do agree with both Zach and Mike that the part of the reason why maritime disputes in the South and East China Seas are a little bit different when it comes to their magnitude is precisely, I think, military balance of power, right? In the East China Sea, the military balance of power between China and Japan would be a lot more balanced, and would say it might be more advantageous for Japan. But when it comes to the South China Sea, it's a lot more asymmetrical, and China has a lot more advantage in that regard, particularly when it comes to the Philippines. So that might be partially why issues in the South China Sea tend to be a little bit more unstable than compared to the East China Sea. And when it comes to why the Philippines tends to be singled out, my take is that it does have something to do with, I guess, from China's view, the level of media coverage of these events. So it's not so much, well, it's a combination of the things that other disputants in the South China Sea have done, as well as the media coverage or the international attention of them. So it's true that Vietnam has done certain things that China does not like. Same thing with Malaysia, for example. In an internal map that I got from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, technically most of Malaysia's oil fields are within the Chinese 9-dash line, but you rarely see China using coercion against Malaysia, even though there are some in the past. But when it comes to the actual numbers and frequency, it's much lower than compared to the Philippines, even Vietnam. And my argument is that it has to do with how much these different countries, or how they approach the dispute. So you see a lot of Filipino media reports about the South China Sea issue, as well as, of course, taking it to the international court. And in the Chinese government's response, you'll oftentimes see statements such as the Philippines has made the South China Sea issue hot. Literally, what that means is basically they don't like the media coverage or the media attention of such issues, the rationale being the more reports about these issues, and especially in the age of Twitter, we're actually seeing a lot of direct footage, right, of these resupply missions, as well as the Chinese Coast Guard's use of coercion against those resupply missions. So there's a lot of media coverage around it. So China's fear is that everyone's attention has been directed to these hotspots in the South China Sea, especially around the Philippines. And if China does not take any coercive actions, its own credibility or resolve will be weakened, will be perceived as being weakened by other states. So this oftentimes will drive China to use coercion more frequently or in a much greater magnitude. And of course, another reason, at least that's my guess, as to why China does not also use as much coercion to Vietnam as compared to the Philippines, is that it does recognize that it does not want to technize every single country in ASEAN. So it's sort of using, I would say, what Andrew Taffer at the NDU would suggest, a divide and conquer kind of strategy, right? Dangling carrots to some countries while singling out other countries, so as to make the signaling effect, I guess, as maximum as possible.
And just does that complicate deterrence? So you mentioned that China almost feels compelled that it has to do something because it's become an international incident. And does that then mean that if the United States were to communicate, say, behind closed doors, hey, you need to knock this off, and we're serious, we're not kidding about this? Because that's my understanding of what happened after Scarborough Shoal, was the United States sort of tried to communicate, hey, don't expand anymore in this area. Otherwise, there'll be consequences. And for a while, at least, it seemed like that might have worked. I guess my question is, under what, if any, conditions do you think some kind of deterrent signal could be sent, either from the Philippines or in conjunction with the United States, that might get China to either take these ongoing talks more seriously or to just back off entirely?
Right. That's a great question. And I think here I do agree with Zach that like more actions should be taken on the part of especially the United States, especially to increase the Philippines' military capability more so in the long term. But I guess I guess it's hard to do, but it might be more effective when it comes to deterrence if there can be, or if the pattern is more actions, less talk, right? So more private channels of communication, and I guess less, I would say, like media reports of these statements per se. But in the age of, again, I would say social media, it's really difficult to do that. But I think one example that I think is a pretty successful deterrence effort on the part of the United States is about China's land reclamation in around 2015. I think Zach has written about that as well. So China actually has plans to reclaim the Scarborough Shoal, and that was put in place back in 2013 in government documents, provincial level ones. But the second term of the Obama administration had some pretty clear signals and red lines about not reclaiming the Scarborough Shoal. And the result is that China has refrained from reclaiming the Scarborough Shoal, even though it did a lot of reclamation in the 2013 to 2014 period. So I guess the lesson then is that the United States should send clear signals or clear red lines, but that should also be accompanied with actual actions, so that it can actually signal that the United States cares about the Philippines. But that would be much more effective if it's done in a relatively more private channels. But sort of the being a mediator of the disputes that you just mentioned in 2012, I'm not sure if that will be as productive, because I think China's view is that these disputes are bilateral and it should be dealt with directly between China and the Philippines. And the involvement of the United States may not necessarily, at least in the public sense might not necessarily be welcomed by the Chinese government. But I think my take is that more actions should be taken, but it should be done in a more discreet kind of manner.
Okay, so red lines communicated in private, backed up by actions. Zach, I guess what's your take? And I want to incorporate one of the questions from the audience. And for everyone that's watching, if you want to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A box, and I'll try to work it into the conversation. But one question that came up is President Marcos has said that the death of a Philippine member of the armed forces would essentially trigger the mutual defense treaty. So as much as Beijing would love to bilateralize this, the Philippines is actively trying to multilateralize this and bring the United States in. And so I guess my two questions are, first of all, do you think that that is in line with U.S. thinking on the matter? In other words, do you think American policymakers consider death of a Filipino service member as a clear red line that would lead to more concerted U.S. action? And then second of all, if beyond that, what are some of the other red lines the United States should be trying to draw, if any? And then what are some of the actions it could take to back up those threats? You kind of mentioned some a little bit earlier, but this would be a great time to expand on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I would say I don't think anyone knows exactly what would get the Mutual Defense Treaty invoked, right? And I would actually say in many ways the Philippines has been very hesitant to invoke the treaty for good reason, right? The best outcome here for the Philippines would be if they can persuade Beijing to adjust its approach without having to have a mutual defense treaty invocation, which I think would clearly ramp up tensions. It might be required, but it would be very difficult then to back down the escalation ladder. So, under what circumstances is someone killed? Is it, it would probably matter a lot, right? Is it a Chinese Coast Guard or naval personnel member actually shooting or stabbing one of them and that killing them directly? That would probably be different than if a, Philippine Coast Guard member was hit with a water cannon that, and hit their head against a boat and ended up dying as a result. So I think the exact situations are very difficult to predict here. What the treaty actually says, of course, is that an armed attack against a Philippine public vessel or Philippine armed forces could trigger the consultations that the treaty would require. Now, exactly what is an armed attack? I think the US government has armies of lawyers, and the Philippine government does too, to try and figure this out. But look, this at the end of the day is going to be in part a political question, both for the White House and for counterparts in Manila.
And yeah, and then to follow up on the actions that the U.S. could take, especially, as Ketian points out, in the gray zone, it's just hard because is the United States really going to use military force in response to, say, China shooting water cannons at a resupply vessel?
And the answer to that, I think, is no, that's very unlikely. But this is where the point that Ketian made about the tension between the Philippine strategy and the potential American strategy is very real, right? If you've called the Philippine strategy radical transparency, perhaps, that's almost the opposite of what some in the United States would want to do, which would be to quietly signal to China that the US is going to push back very hard and risk substantial escalation. I think that's what the United States did about a decade ago when China tried to reclaim land at Scarborough Shoal, and that was effective. But it is very much at odds with the transparency approach that the Philippines has taken. And so Manila and Washington are going to have to be on exactly the same page. I think that's easier said than done. The allies are close, but they don't have the same type of cooperation yet that the US has, say, with South Korea or Japan or Australia. So this is difficult, and I think we're going to have to learn from some of these incidents about how to cooperate, how to communicate with one another. It's going to take some time. But as I said, I do think the likely path, if China continues to escalate, is for the US to assist the Philippines with these resupply efforts. What could that mean? That could mean an American ship or American aircraft being very nearby as Philippine resupply vessels head to the Sierra Madre. Or if those challenges continue, potentially the US could directly airdrop food and water into the Sierra Madre, or even use U.S. Coast Guard or more likely U.S. naval vessels in one of these types of situations. So would that potentially be escalatory? Yes. But at some point, I think there's an argument that if you know that there's going to end up being a crisis that's likely to invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty, maybe you should consider short-circuiting that possibility and going ahead and making very clear to China that this pressure will not work, and therefore trying to get out of a crisis before one begins.
Ketian, this crisis is taking place in a pretty crowded area, as you've studied, and so I'm wondering if any of the regional dynamics have any effect on either the deterrent signals the United States would try to send, or your sense of the likelihood that this crisis continues to escalate. So we've talked about Vietnam and what it's doing. I don't know if there's any kind of regional attempts to multilateralize again the South China Sea disputes in a way that are giving China problems, or whether it seems like China is adapting quite well and has found ways to divide and conquer other countries that have claims in the South China Sea and is therefore able to bilateralize each of these. And so we really can talk about this as essentially the Philippines backed by the United States taking on China over the Second Thomas Shoal.
I think this is a really important and great question in a sense that I mean, it's hard to evaluate whether China has completely successfully divided and conquer these disputes in the South China Sea, but I think at the same time, China does, and at least in my view, has relatively successfully prevented the South China Sea issue from being really effectively discussed, right, in any venues within ASEAN. For example, I think China and ASEAN signed the declaration of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. I think that's 2002 or so, and they have been forever discussing or coming up with the draft of the COC, the actual Code of Conduct, but that has been basically stalled because China has wanted to put in the COC, the document that should potentially guide any behavior in the South China Sea in the ways that China wants it to be. And as a result, these more, I would say, more multilateral approaches or attempts in reducing tension in the South China Sea have been pretty unsuccessful, and partially, I think, because of China's strategy not to put any restraints on essentially China's behavior in the South China Sea. So I would say if you look at China's relations with Vietnam or Malaysia, and that's disputes in the South China Sea, they seem to be relatively stable. And I think the Vietnamese officials have just recently visited China. I think that's in May or something like that, a month or 2 months ago. And there are other countries in ASEAN, in Southeast Asia, that are not even party to the South China Sea. So I think that's adding to the complication of to what extent countries in the region can be effective in deterring China from using coercion in the future. And in addition, the sort of divide and conquer reality in Southeast Asia has made, in my view, U.S. deterrence much more difficult as well. Because I think the United States would very much want to have ASEAN on board, but in fact, ASEAN, it's not exactly united when it comes to these territorial disputes, partially because that some countries are not party to the disputes, and partially because China has in certain, or from the perspective of certain ASEAN countries, China still has a lot of economic attractions, such that they're not unified together when it comes to, say, disputes in the South China Sea, especially targeted at one single country as opposed to, say, all countries in the region.
Can you talk a bit about more of that? Because your research is great on showing that China, it's not like it just uses one instrument of statecraft against one country, but it will combine diplomatic, military, and economic instruments as part of this broader strategic package. So how has China incorporated some of the economic inducements and coercion alongside the paramilitary coercion that it's showing in the South China Sea?
Sure. That's a really great point. forgotten that I've actually written about things that are not about coercion as well. So I think there are two, I guess, tactics or things that China tends to do when it comes to using coercion. One is that it does not use coercion against a single country all the time. So even when it comes to the Philippines, there are periods where China seems to agree that using economic incentives would be a lot more effective. So that tends to be the period of the previous administration, where China uses a lot of direct foreign direct investment in the Philippines. So it's a combination of using economic incentives as well as coercion in different periods of time. So that's within one single country. And the second, I would say, tactic would be to use coercion, for example, on the Philippines, and simultaneously sending economic incentives or economic carrots to other countries in the region around the same time, so as to basically signal that if you don't do what the Philippines has done, you're going to continuously receive these economic carrots. And if you follow what the Philippines has done, then you're going to see, or you're going to be on the receiver end of coercion, just like the Philippines did. So I think that seems to be what China has done in regard to Southeast Asia. So I don't really study I don't study positive economic statecraft per se, but I think there are scholars like Mike Lampton, who has written a lot about China's Belt and Road initiatives, especially in Southeast Asia, focusing on basic infrastructure, I guess with the term of connectivity, focusing on railways and trains and roads and other kinds of things in, for example, I think Cambodia, Laos, etc. So these are the large infrastructure projects in countries that are not party to the disputes will tend to be, I guess, a useful tool for China to essentially divide and conquer ASEAN when it comes to disputes in the South China Sea, because there are in the past several ASEAN meetings where the issue of the South China Sea would have been brought up, but it was basically prevented by countries that are much closer to China, such as I would say Cambodia and Laos, for example. I think that partially can be attributed to the positive economic statecraft that China has done in the past and has continuously to do at present as well.
So, Zach, it sounds like, at least from Ketian, there's not much hope of a united front among regional countries against China. They have different interpretations of these territorial disputes. China has various economic inducements it can use to play divide and conquer. Is that your sense of the region? And then, I mean, because you work so much with other U.S. allies, do you see any support either coming from Australia or Japan or Taiwan or any other way to multilateralize this conflict? Or do you basically see this as a hub and spokes problem for the United States? It's basically a bilateral situation with the alliance, and these are the major players.
Well, I do think one of the real disappointments for Manila has been that its other members of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, haven't done more, right? ASEAN's been remarkably quiet, understandably so, for all the reasons that Ketian outlined. But I think many of us would have expected a little bit more activity by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or at least some of the member states. And so I would expect that Manila is going to be calling around to its friendly capitals and asking other players in the region to take a little bit more of an active role, even privately with the Chinese, and warning them about the downsides of what has been going on around Second Thomas Shoal and Scarborough Shoal and other places. At the same time, I doubt we're going to see that translate into much more than rhetorical support for Manila. Now, could you get some more public statements from some of the G7 members or from Australia or Korea? Sure, I think that is possible. But I think there's going to be a lot of hesitation on the part of even US allies in Asia to comment on what's going on beyond the usual comments about peace and stability in the South China Sea. Maybe you could get Japan, which just signed a reciprocal access agreement with the Philippines, or Australia to do a joint sail through the South China Sea. Perhaps, in an isolated case, you could get some other countries, whether that's the United Kingdom, or even France or Canada, to do something similar. But I think at the end of the day, the Chinese are going to watch those ships sail away and then go back to the activity they've been typically doing. And so I don't think they're going to fundamentally change Chinese behavior. And this is where the question I think that Ketian was asking earlier about what is the strategy comes back into focus. If the strategy is to internationalize this and to bring more public attention to the South China Sea and to Second Thomas Shoal, then that might be effective. If the objective is to quietly explain to the Chinese why the actions they're taking around Second Thomas Shoal are ultimately going to hurt China's own interests, then these very public shows of force may not be as helpful. And some quiet diplomacy or quiet signaling could be more useful. And so I would expect that Manila and Washington over the next few weeks will really want to sit down together and have these discussions about ultimately what their theory of the case is about convincing Beijing that this coercive activity is not going to pay.
Do you have a sense of where multilateral initiatives may be going? So I've heard that NATO now has this interest in the Asia Pacific, and as you mentioned, some of the UK, France, they've sent sort of token warships into the South China Sea every now and then. India has done something similar, and so you had this specter of these multinational freedom of navigation exercises. You seem to think that these may actually do more harm than good if you're basically creating a situation where China can't back down. But I guess I'm wondering, do you think that they're just going to become more common anyway because it's something that can be done, and it's just a way to sort of show the flag, and so this is what policymakers are going to gravitate around?
It's not that I think they're going to do more harm than good. It's just that I think in general, there's a lot of international relations research on bluffing. And in my experience, bluffing doesn't work. So if you're sending warships to the South China Sea to signal that if there's a crisis there, that you would get involved, that's one thing. If you're sending warships to the South China Sea, but if there was a crisis, you would not get involved, then the signaling value is pretty minimal. And so I think the question will be which of these players would actually do something if, say, the Mutual Defense Treaty was invoked. And my guess is that most of them would be very hesitant. I think, Japan has legal constraints, but might be one of the more forward-leaning of the group. I think the current Australian government would struggle with this issue given the efforts they've made to improve ties with China in the last few months. So it's hard to see a lot of foreign governments outside the United States that would want to, back up those shows of support with real action. And in some ways, I think Beijing will see through that. So, my recommendation to those in the region that are thinking about this is joint sales are great, but if the purpose of the joint sale is to signal something, then make sure that if you have to go ahead and actually take an action, that you're willing to do so.
And Kutian, do you think it's possible to go the other way? So several people in the Q&A have noted that the Philippines has this strategy of transparency and trying to make a big deal out of these disputes. Zack has mentioned that's at certain points anyway, the United States has tried to go more behind the scenes to prevent the kind of situations you talked about earlier. Do you think that do you have a sense of where debates are in Manila and whether it would be possible for the United States and the Philippines to get on the same page in terms of trying to handle things either behind the scenes with China or vice versa to massively escalate in the PR realm and go the opposite direction? Do you have a sense of where that's going?
That's a great question. Although I have to say, I'm unfortunately not a scholar of the domestic politics of the Philippines, but my very minimal 2 cents would be I think there's a rationale for being more transparent and more public about these disputes and China's action as well in the Philippines, right? In the sense that it might be useful in the domestic sense, right? Like nobody wants to be portrayed, especially politicians do not want to be portrayed as being very weak against China and being, I guess, compromising when it comes to territorial disputes that are very important to the Philippines. Because in a way, the South China Sea, it's important for China, but it's not on the level of Taiwan. It's not China's core interest per se, these individual walks in the South China Sea, but it's very much the case for the Philippines, right? It's almost like, I guess, China's Taiwan in a way. So I think it's possible that domestic politics could get in the way of handling the disputes in a more, I guess, quiet manner, in a manner that is not putting China's resolve or perceived resolve to test. And that might be the case for the United States as well when it comes to election seasons, where these rhetorical, basically rhetoric, not necessarily actions, can gain a lot more domestic points for basically democratic countries, right? Because China is not a democratic country, so it doesn't really have to care that much about public opinions per se. I think if the Chinese public were to run the government, we might actually see a lot more drastic kinds of coercion in the South China Sea than compared to the current ones, because the Chinese public, almost the more nationalistic ones, almost always complain that the government is too soft when it comes to its actions in the South China Sea. So I agree very much with Zack that if the two countries can be on the same page when it comes to a more substantive, but also substantial, but also quiet strategy. But at the same time, domestic politics might be in the way.
Okay, well, in the few minutes we have remaining, I wanted to ask you each about implications for Taiwan. So, Zack, several people have mentioned in the chat that there may be reputational concerns here. So, do you think that the United States has to maybe take a firmer stand vis-a-vis the Philippines, because it also has to signal that it's going to be tough on territorial disputes in general, and especially on the Taiwan issue, or maybe because the United States feels it needs to have a good relationship with the Philippines and base access for a potential Taiwan contingency, and therefore absolutely has to back the Philippines. I guess the question is, how do you think this particular crisis, if at all, affects how the United States can deter China over Taiwan? One of the folks in the audience mentioned that former Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger recently said that China's actions near the Second Thomas Shoal are a, quote, dress rehearsal for the CCP's plans to invade Taiwan. So what's your take about how this may spill over to the Taiwan issue?
Yeah, I saw Matt an hour or so after he made that comment last week. And look, I think the reality is that Taiwan and the Philippines are very different, and Matt knows that. But the connection, as you noted, is there is some reputational concern, right? The US has a very clear mutual defense treaty with the Philippines going back decades and decades and decades. The US does not any longer have a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. And so it's a more tenuous commitment, really, going back to the Six Assurances and the Taiwan Relations Act. And so I do understand why people say, well, if the US won't support the Philippines more forcefully, then how can you believe that it would support Taiwan? On the other hand, as we all know, there's a huge amount of academic literature about reputation and fighting for reputation, which is quite mixed. And so I guess my bottom line here is I don't think there's a 100% clear answer, but what I have tried to explain to Chinese counterparts is that, look, you shouldn't expect the United States to react the same way to pressure over Second Thomas Shoal today as it reacted a little over a decade ago. In other words, yes, the US under Kurt Campbell sort of backed off a little bit around Second Thomas or around Scarborough Shoal a decade ago. I don't think that's necessarily what the United States would do today for the very reasons that you're mentioning, right? The US needs access in the Philippines more than it felt that it needed it a decade ago. So that's one element. I think the US-Philippines relationship is closer today than it was a decade ago. So that's another aspect. And third, and I think this should not be overlooked, When the U.S. negotiated the disengagement around Scarborough Shoal, that if you ask American policymakers, they didn't really understand exactly what was going to happen in the disengagement. And I think Chinese policymakers have therefore overinterpreted that as a demonstration that the U.S. didn't really have a willingness to show commitment to the Philippines. I think all of those factors are different now than they were a little over a decade ago. And so I do think that if push came to shove, this administration would stand pretty firmly with the Philippines. And I'll just note that the two of the officials that are most involved in this, Mira Rapp-Hooper and Eli Ratner, are people that are directly involved on South China Sea issues for quite a long time. Eli wrote one of the more forward-leaning pieces by a Democratic policymaker on the South China Sea well over a decade ago. And Mira Rapp-Hooper was the person that founded the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, which tracked what the Chinese were doing there. So we may have had our eye off the ball a little bit at Scarborough Shoal last decade. That's not going to be the case this time around.
Is that your sense too, Ketian, that China sort of got away with it because the United States came in to try to negotiate an end to that standoff? The Philippines withdrew and China stayed. But Zach is saying, okay, well, times are different now, and the United States has more credibility in terms of showing that it'll stand up to Chinese coercion and aggression and territorial expansion in the South China Sea. So that's question number one. Do you think that essentially Beijing's decision calculus is different today than it was when that crisis broke out in the early 2010s? And then the second question is the same one I asked Zach. Do you think that there are implications for deterrence in the Taiwan Strait over how the United States and the Philippines handle this issue over Second Thomas Shoal? Or do you think that really the Taiwan issue is a special case for both Beijing, Washington, as well as countries in the region, and therefore the reputational travel is not going to be nearly as seamless?
So yeah, for the first question, I think Beijing's calculation does update. I think not just because of what has progressed in the South China Sea in terms of the United States clarifying further its commitment with regard to the Philippines, but also I think that's more, at least in my view, that's more or less of a reflection of ongoing U.S.-China relations. Basically, I think from what I understand, Beijing's view is that the United States is not going to back down on almost anything, certainly not on Taiwan, certainly not on the South China Sea, just as a not a natural, but as a current state of the relationship between the two countries. So I think it's perceptions about potential U.S. response is definitely much, is that the United States would react a lot more readily, as well as in a more, I guess, a drastic manner than compared to, say, 12 years ago. And on the second question about what is the implication for Taiwan, I would say I would agree with Zach more on this in the sense that I don't think maritime disputes in the South China Sea and Taiwan are the same thing. I think they're pretty different kinds of matters, and I think so I don't study reputation or how allies perceive U.S. Alliance credibility per se. So I'm just parroting my colleague Matt Kanziger at the Shaw School and his more recent research. From what I understand, he hasn't published it yet, but it will be very much soon. And his argument is that what happens or how allies perceive commitment or U.S. resolve, it's not necessarily that if the United States responds in a Taiwan contingency, then it will automatically respond in their own contingency. They still take into account whether and how the United States responds in a given scenario, as well as analyze their own situation when it comes to whether the United States will come to their aid. So the point here, if I think Mike is accurate, then what that applies to the South China Sea issue then is that it's not gonna automatically transfer or translate to any U.S. response in regard to the Taiwan scenario. So in that case, it's not necessarily that these two issues are connected per se. but how that will be received or perceived in Taiwan is something that I think is very much worth researching in the future.
Okay, well, we're unfortunately out of time, but we live in interesting times, so we're going to find out answers to some of these questions one way or another. Zach, thank you so much for your time. Ketian, especially, thank you for sacrificing your rest and comfort. I hope you get some sleep back in Beijing. And to everyone who came to attend, we'll be posting this video up on YouTube so that folks that came in late can catch the parts of the conversation that they missed. Thank you so much to all of our supporters at FPRI, and we'll see you next time on one of these events. Take care, everyone.